Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for 360 Feedback Coaching, a masterclass for consultants. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll take care of a few housekeeping items and introductions. I'm Jessie Bieringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group and our Partner Program Coordinator, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function throughout the presentation. We'll answer as many of your questions as we can at the end. So joining me to discuss 360 feedback today is 3D Group President Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is the founder of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose is an author and co-editor of the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. He's also a fellow of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. In addition to designing custom 360 feedback systems for clients, Dr. Rose personally coaches leaders in focused post 360 feedback sessions. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first line supervisor. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CEO World, and HR.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dale, to get us started.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all for joining me today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, 360 feedback, and specifically 360 feedback as it relates to what do you do with the data once you get it. So I'd like to the orientation today is going to be toward a consultant or a coach who's working with an individual after they've got their feedback, and I'm going to start with the assumption that you've already been doing this. There's some experience you've got and try to get into some of the a little bit more of the subtleties and details and really how to level up your game when you think about how to do the process. Um, I've got sort of 5 topics that I'm going to try to hit around how to get the most out of that coaching engagement. We think about it as feedback coaching. Our bias is very much toward folks that do executive coaching, doing that 1 hour coaching session to help leaders figure out what do they do with the feedback. And these 5 topics I think will help you improve the effectiveness of and the outcomes that you get from those 1 hour sessions. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Also, I should point out, I will be going fairly quickly because I've got 5 topics and a lot of detail on some of them, but I will try to leave some time at the end for questions. If you have questions as they come up, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll make sure to get to them at the end. And I will go back and look at any slides we need to address those questions. All right, great. So let's start at the beginning. The first thing to think about when you're talking with someone about their feedback is context. So many folks will look, say, at a personality profile and they'll be able to, write up, what does this personality profile mean? What does this tell me about this leader? And that's a reasonable thing to do because it came from one source and personality is pretty stable. It does change a little bit over time, but it's fairly stable. 360 feedback is about behavior with a certain set of individuals at a certain point of time in a certain setting. So it's very important that you not look at a 360 report before having talked to someone and assume, frankly, that you know much of anything about what that report says. The report out of context, frankly, doesn't mean much. So, how long has this person been in role? Oh, it's only been 2 weeks? Well, gee, maybe that explains some of the data. Um, what were the rater characteristics? So I looked at your direct report scores, and obviously you don't know how to delegate, and you're a micromanager. Oh, wait, all of your direct reports are on PIPs. Okay, I understand a little bit more. Versus if you get that kind of data and you've got superstars in there. So you need to find out a little bit about where the data came from. Super important to understand the strength of the relationship with their manager. So often you'll look at ratings from a manager, and it's not always clear from those ratings, is this someone trying to be constructive and really push their person, or are they really trying to do a wake up call and get them to pay attention? The other thing is that the manager should be a critical resource after this conversation for follow-up around how to work on development. So understanding what's your relationship like with your manager? How likely are they to help support you through your development is going to shift a lot of the coaching that you're doing. So I ask very directly, how's it going with your manager? How long have they been your manager? Do you feel like they'll support you in your development? And so understanding these three basic things, and there are other elements of context, what's been going on in your organization, how, are there any big business shifts or strategy shifts, things along those lines? What's the history of your group? Those can be also very useful, but at minimum, I would hit these three. And then after you've got a sense of context, I also like actually to go through and understand the characteristic, particularly of the peers. Like, are these line peers that just report up to your same manager, or did you choose coworkers, colleagues that you depend on for other things? The next pivot is, what did you think about the report? So that really should be the launch into the conversation is, what did you, the person who's receiving this feedback, think of the report? You'll find most of the time leaders want to hear from, they'll want to hear from me. I'm the expert. So what's your opinion of it? But I find that that's often sort of an excuse to situate the feedback as a report card. You tell me if I'm good or bad is kind of the fundamental thing that they're asking. And that's very natural. It happens frequently. But if you start with what do they think about it, you're going to figure out where their energy is, where their focus is, where they might be most likely to spend energy on their own development. So always start with what they think. You'll get around to, wait, you seem to overlook this critical data point or that critical data point, or there was something in the report that didn't make sense to me. Can you help explain it? But don't overlook the opportunity to let them own their feedback and help you sort of see it from their perspective, because I think that often provides a very, very valuable lens. So context is key. Always start there. Second data point, uh, interpreting unusual data patterns. So I will confess early on there will be some math in this presentation. We won't dig deep into it just now, but it is coming. So often you'll see data in a report that's fairly consistent. All high scores, all low scores. What's interesting about 360 feedback is you often find contradictory data. So people tend to walk around in the world expecting that they are a consistent person, that they behave the same way in all contexts. I am good, I am bad, kind of core self-image things that we carry around in our head. But when you look at 360 data, it turns out, oh, well, actually, you look quite different from different groups, which is, of course, the point of it. And again, how it differs significantly from personality data. So, how do you deal with these sort of differences? How do you deal with this in context and in a conversation with a leader? So, let's look at a report and look at some examples to kind of think through how you might interpret some of these different profiles. So, these are I'm using the 3D group report format. I'll explain it briefly how to read it if you aren't familiar with it. But these are item level data. So one of the items, and I just kind of grabbed some specific items that had some interesting patterns. One of the items is informs others of rationale behind organizational strategies. You can see you've got 5 rater groups here: self, manager, peer, direct report, and other. Other could be anything. Um, and then apologize, you can't quite see the rating scale here. Actually, I'll push forward just to explain it. Here you go. There's your rating scale from 1 to 5. So considerable development needed as a 1, 5 exceptional, no development needed, etc. And the bubbles are how many people from that group provided that rating. Okay. So, and then of course the manager and self, not anonymous. The numbers, of course, are anonymous, no names. And then you can see also, I'll jump back to the previous one. You can see also we have a national norm in there. So that national norm, you can kind of highlight it here. This national norm is, we've got the new numbers, but then we've also got a nice little hockey stick that shows you where it lands as compared to the average for the individual, and you can see this overlap in the hockey stick suggests that the person exceeded the norm. So that's kind of how you read these items. Well, what does this particular set of data mean? So clearly, the other group feels pretty strongly that this person excels. The manager's pretty happy, but there's a subset of two folks in that peer group that feel this individual does not do a particularly good job of connecting others to the rationale behind strategies, and the person themselves feel like they've got some room to improve as well. So again, someone's like, well, do I do this or don't I do this? Well, the reality is that maybe they're informing others. Maybe they're informing direct reports, although it's notable that there's two data points missing from direct reports there. But there's some peers they aren't. So the way I approach this is to simply ask them, well, think about your peer group. And, we don't really know exactly who gave you these twos. Um, it's not that important to kind of track down the raters. But when you think about your peer group, who do you spend more time connecting with around why you're going about pursuing a particular strategy or another, and when that's where the value of this kind of format can be very helpful, because if you just get an average score of 3, it's like, oh, this could be something you could do better at, but you don't really know, and you're not really thinking about how that what that variability looks like within that rater group. So spend a little time having them think through. And it may be there are 3 or 4 or more peers that they realize, I don't really connect with that person around the why. I just kind of tell them what we're doing. And it maybe there's the opportunity. So, I like to say there are no outliers, and that's certainly a case there. Now, then you look down at the next item, follows through and commitments, similar kind of approach. Maybe, some of the peers in here are not seeing the action in terms of follow through. There's lots of commitments, but no action. But others do. So maybe you're following through with some commitments and not following through with others. Now I put these together for an important point. One of the most common interpretations that you'll see from a leader, and this is just pure Gestalt psychology, is they'll look at this and they'll go, "Oh, obviously there are two peers who don't like me," because they assume that the two peers that said they didn't inform others of rationale are the same two that think they don't follow through on commitments. And that, of course, is not true, or may not be true. We don't know. They're completely independent. So, very difficult, especially if you get reds, if you get ones on here and you get multiple ones, very, very difficult to convince somebody it's not one person that doesn't like them. But the truth is that we don't see those patterns typically. It does happen, but it's very rare. Um, so you want to be cautious and careful around that sort of an interpretation. You also want to be very cautious around, not looking at just a singular answer, and to recognize that, there are, you know, multiple perspectives within a group. Okay. Let's see, another interesting data point here. So builds dedication and commitment to company strategy, right? Again, here we see this the variation in treatment becomes critical, and you can see here how the context becomes important again, because who's in that other group, and it may be that this individual with those those folks is just not doing this this behavior in the way they should, at least not with everybody, because someone thinks they're exceptional at it. So again, the opportunity here is to actually help them think through, well, think through that other group. Who is that and how do you do that? Reflect more. You raise yourself a 3, so you don't think you're exceptional at this all the time, despite the fact that others feel you're quite strong. But there is no one answer. You don't do it or don't do it. It's with certain individuals. So that the action item here becomes following up with some folks in that other group to say, hey, I want to make sure that I'm clear about why we're doing what we're doing, what we're doing. It also, by the way, of course, fits with the prior item. So it could be that there's a pattern there. But again, not looking for it as a singular answer, but as a nuanced, more complex answer. And you can see here how that you're building toward actions after your session, right? You're trying to help give them, in a sense, to dos of how they can follow up on the feedback, understand it better, and start taking action that's a little bit more precise than, say, sort of the blunt instrument of, oh, I just need to work harder at doing this with everyone. That may or may not be true because, for example, with peers, they feel they're doing this exceptionally well. And the strategy of doing this with the other group may end up being radically different than the strategy with the direct report group, for example, where they don't see this person as excelling, but doing okay. Another sort of odd data point to consider is when you get missing data, right? So any good 360 survey should have a don't know, not applicable option because you're using items that are standardized across all leaders, but they may not have observed it. Certain raters may not have observed. This happens most frequently in sort of talent management items from peers, where there'll be an item, say, around assigns work appropriately or delegates effectively, and peers may not have visibility to that. So they need to be able to sort of opt out and not provide a guess, which then gives you noise in your data and impacts your validity in a negative way. So, I love it when I see data like this. Nobody in the other group rated this person on sets challenging goals for others. Again, maybe these are internal customers and they're not really sure how this person sets goals, and they're thinking about it in the context of their direct reports. So they're not really doing much there. And that's great. This shows that the raters are actually being pretty attentive in the way they answer the questions. They're not just going through, oh, this person's good, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. They're actually differentiating based on the item in the particular situation. Also worth pointing out here, sets challenging goals for others among peers, wide range. But how much am I going to index on setting challenging goals for others among the peers? Again, that's going to depend on context. How much am I setting goals in a situation in which peers recognize it? They may not just see this leader as pushing forward hard enough, but certainly the direct reports see it. So within that context, they're fine, but it may not emerge as a top priority because this particular behavior with feedback from peers, they just may not be in the best position to rate that behavior. And so it may not be one that you want to double down on. Again, depending on context, it could be that they're working really hard on setting organizational goals with their peer group, and this shows they do need to develop. So context is gonna play as well. Let's see. I am going to move forward into the blind spots piece. So this is last slide on this in this subject. So most any 360 report's going to show you blind spots and strengths. They should be analyzing how your self scores compare to others. What our feedback report does that very few do, and is important to understand sort of the value and differences, is we look at, and it's very small on the bottom down there, but we look at subgroup differences when it comes to self versus other ratings. So you can see here that there was a blind spot, let's say on the first item, item 14, for all rater groups. The rater groups rated the person lower than they rated themselves, and appreciably lower. Usually it's 2 points. But interestingly, in the next one, item 50, that other group didn't see that difference. And then you can see on the very last, well, let's see, 32 there. No, let's go. The very last item in the orange on the lower left sets challenging yet appropriate goals. The direct report was the lower, really rated the person lower, but everyone else doesn't see a problem. So there could be a blind spot that's specific to that rater group, not just writ large. Okay, so overall blind spots are a big deal. You see that behaviorally in that first one, but it could be that one rater group sees a real difference there, and that's worth drilling into. And of course, the same is true on the flip side. The green dots all represent unexpected strengths, areas where they thought they really had room to improve, and others say, no, you're doing great here. Don't waste any of your development effort on that. And that can also be a pretty big aha. Those unexpected strengths can also be very powerful when confidence is an issue. So a lot of times you'll see a pattern where people are rating themselves low and others are rating them really high, and it's totally unexpected. And what they really need is some confidence that, hey, you've got a lot of support within the organization here. The other thing that our report does that's really pretty important is this 2x2 box. And what that provides, and it can get glossed over because it's a little nuanced, but what that does is something that's very challenging to do looking at a data report yourself, which is it looks at the self rating on each item and compares it to every single other rating. And it adds up, well, how many of these are within one of each other when they're high scores, 4 or 5. So if I rated myself a 4, how many times did others give me a 4, a 5, or a 3, where we're pretty much aligned? And that's going to show up in that gray bubble up there. So 53% of the time across all those pairwise uh, uh, comparisons, high scores on self were associated with high scores from others. Likewise, we've got blind spots and unexpected strengths, in which, so blind spots would be areas where the others rated the person 2 points lower and in the low zones for 1 or 2, and they rated themselves higher by 2 points. So this is like, what percentage of time do people see you really differently in one direction or the other on particular behaviors? We like to see the green and the orange bubbles kind of below 10%, right? Above 10%, this suggests, this one here, that the person's got a little above, what we'd like to see in terms of their blind spots. They may not be as self-aware as we'd like to see. Sometimes you'll see that green bubble quite large, 25, 30%, and a very, very small, if not, or a 0% on the blind spots. So in that case, again, this is maybe that confidence issue, and it can be a way to sort of illustrate, hey, you really are seeing like a lot less strength than other people, and it shows up across the entire survey without having to get into too much of the specific items. It's just generally, where's your self-awareness? Okay, so that's a little bit about sort of some details and subtleties and nuances in terms of how to look at the report. Let's take a look at rater sampling. So rater sampling is really important. So who's identified to provide feedback, of course, is a critical part of the process. All kinds of pros and cons and yeses and nos about, does the self select the raters? Does the manager approve those raters? Does it pump out of your HRS? Bottom line, individuals should select their own raters. It's going to increase their acceptance of the data a ton. Ideally, their manager is involved enough in the process that they're looking at it, making sure it's not the friends and family plan. And if you're pumping data out of the HRIS, a lot of firms that do started with employee surveys and then decided, oh, I'll just add on a 360 to our platform, have this capability and leverage it for employee surveys. So I think, well, let's just do it for 360. Turns out to be pretty flawed, because the data may or may not be useful for the individual, just because the org chart says these are people who should be working with you. That may not be the case for the last 6, 12 months. This peer group, they may have been on a assignment elsewhere. These direct reports may have shifted, and what we find too are the data aren't always accurate. So it's important to understand a little bit about the rating. The other things about those raters to look at is, like, imagine this is kind of our image for thinking about what 360 feedback looks like. So, imagine, like, let's take a look at that other group. If you want to understand how rater sampling affects results, imagine if in those four raters in that other group, if that guy in the lower left just didn't fill out his survey, your results are going to look radically different, right? Again, assuming that his facial expressions reflect how he rates people. But you have to be aware of how inclusive that group is and who actually is providing the data. So let me get more specific. So most reports will provide, who was invited to complete the survey. So it might look something like this. You've got a group of peers, you've got a group of direct reports, and you've got this smaller group of others. And that's useful to have an idea of sort of, who may be included in the data. And then you may get a report out that says, oh, 4 of the peers and 5 of the direct reports and, let's say 2 of the others completed the survey, but they don't tell you who. And most folks will say that this is to prevent, to assure confidentiality in the data, so people don't know who said what. The challenge with this, there are many challenges, but one of the big challenges is it's not actually true. Um, if you, if everybody fills out the survey, then you know who filled out the survey. So if it says 100% response rate, or what is this? I think it's 8 out of 8 peers, 8 out of 8 direct reports, 3 out of 3 others, you know who filled out the survey. So even in those cases where they say they're only presenting invited, they're not. My point is that knowing who responded has a huge impact on your interpretation. So having a report that says, hey, Warren Bennis was invited, John Carson was invited, Bob Smith was invited, but they didn't fill out the survey. very, very powerful data. Now, you're still going to protect confidentiality. You're not going to, for example, in the other group, if only two people responded, you're not going to report the data because that does start to get too thin. Our benchmark study shows that over 80% of companies use three as the minimum threshold. So three is the minimum threshold. Seems like a reasonable one to use to report separate data. But you get so much more out of knowing who filled out the survey. So let me give you an example. So let's say we're looking at these data, and on the left we have the invited group, right? So these 7, 8 people were invited from the direct report group to complete the survey. And as you can see here, we had 5 direct reports respond to this item about allows adequate autonomy and does not micromanage. Well, okay. So I know that, let me make sure I get the number right. 2, 4, 6, 7 people completed this, were invited, and only 5 responded. So do I have a representative sample of this whole group? So I can look at this and say, all right, some people feel I do this well, some people feel I don't, maybe not. Well, let me give you a little bit of extra data. And then what if I tell you, oh, actually, 2 of these people, Maria and Margaret, are on PIPs? Hmm, that might change my interpretation. And remember, I got this in the context, right? So in my beginning of my interpretation, I find out that Maria and Margaret are on PIPs. That actually might change my interpretation a little bit. But boy, I do wonder, were those the 2 that didn't fill it out? Are those the 2 that rated a 2 here? Or are those the 2 that rated? Well, we don't really know. We're not going to put names on who rated what. But there's an awful lot of noise here in trying to interpret what this looks like. So if you expand it and say, well, actually, when we look at the data, so like what you'll find out, say, is okay, Maria and Margaret are in PIPs. Everyone else, superstars. They're great. I'd hire them again. I want to do nothing but reward them and give them more challenging work. They're all fantastic. Then you look at your rater list and change it up a little bit, and you find out that, oh, Maria and Margaret actually didn't fill the survey out. So you've got 2 people who you think are superstars who are telling you that you are micromanaging and not giving them enough autonomy. Think about the shift in what you're suggesting from a development perspective by knowing this information. It's radical and it has a huge effect on the validity of the decisions the person makes about how they're going to approach dealing with the feedback. So, understanding the context, understanding specifically who filled out the survey within the paradigm that you're still protecting who said what, you're never listing who said what, and you're minimizing or keeping that minimum of 3, absolutely critical. So I would argue that understanding who the respondents were is essential, and it has absolutely no effect really on confidentiality or security in the data. So again, just imagining this radar group totally different. Now let's think about this from the size of the sample as well and the effect that little differences can have on numbers. So this is going to be useful when you start thinking about the effect of your sampling, particularly on um, scores over time, which is another sort of dimension to consider. So imagine you've got, this same group of raters, and these raters produce a rating that looks like this. So I'm using the same item. I've got this rating scale, same rating scale we used before. And you look at time 1 and you say, oh, look, we had, one rater gave a 2, another rater gave a 2, the third rater gave a 4, and the fourth rater gave a 5. So differences of opinion here, right? Again, 2 people feel like room to improve. 2 people feel like great, love it, keep giving me autonomy. So overall average of 3.25. So then you look at time 2 to see, well, gee, has there been any improvement? Well, the average score is 3.75. The standard deviation on this on items tends to be around 0.5. It does vary a little bit, but 0.5 is a pretty good rule of thumb. A full standard deviation improvement, that's amazing. But if you look at the data a little more closely, you realize, oh, wait a minute, one rater saw a shift. Is that really a shift or not? And So this is where, again, recognizing that you're drawing conclusions based on extremely small samples. So when you're looking at time, changes over time, as I'll get to in a moment, this is kind of a perfect tee up for that. You have to be very, very careful because this effect is quite different. For example, we saw one rater number 2 change their rating from a 2 to a 4. Everyone else was the same. But you could be looking at data that look like this, where actually 3 raters changed their ratings. In fact, 4 raters changed their ratings now that I'm looking at it, right? So rater 3 and 4 flip-flopped. One got a little less, one got a little more, a little bit better, but all still within that strength zone. So order of magnitude, they still feel like the person's doing it well, but they shifted. Raider 2 saw a little bit of an improvement. Raider 1 saw a little bit of improvement. So what's really going on here? It's very difficult to interpret how much that change was with 4 raters. And it's not uncommon that you see 4 raters or a really small sample. So the point is that very small shifts when you have small samples can make a huge difference in average scores. So you want to be very careful. And I'll show you this in a little bit more detail. So let's dive into this question of the pretest or pretest post-test format, which is often again a question that people will look at when they're looking at their report. Well, gee, I looked at my last report and all the scores went up or down. So when you think about pretest post-test, there's the bottom line you'll hear is extreme caution when it comes to interpreting scores in this way. There are quite a few challenges in terms of interpretation. So the bottom line is that, while we think of change scores as being able to illustrate change, they in fact can hide change. They're not necessarily effective at showing you the kind of change that you're looking for, and there's some better ways to go about it. So first consideration is, for example, items versus competencies. I'll dive into that in a little bit more detail. But am I looking at changes in specific items? Or am I looking at change in competencies? Quite a bit harder to see change in competencies. And then one thing that's really important to recognize is that change may not be observed by all raters, right? So it could be that people don't see the actual shift. And there's only a few people that are the focus, and with such small samples, that can be very problematic. So let's look at what these kind of results might look like. So I look at this leader who's got a rating, an overall rating on their developing talent, 4.0. Overall, a strength, clearly something they do well. Uh, Probably not a concern from a development standpoint if they're getting an average score uh, overall on developing talent of 4.0. And here's kind of our definition of developing talent. But the interesting thing is when you start looking at details. So let's look at the items that load up into that overall average score of 4.0. Direct reports, challenging assignments. Wow, great at that. Really pushes people. Fantastic. Sharing relevant knowledge and wisdom. Pretty solid. Doing that pretty well. Consistent. Holding direct reports accountable for their professional development. A little bit lower, not too bad, but maybe there's an area to think about. Hires top talent. Boy, this person goes out and really finds the best of the best. That's great. Oops, here we go. Removes or develops poor performers. Not so good. In fact, pretty darn bad. Challenging, at, to say the least. They will provide feedback, but it sounds like they really are not making decisions that they need to make. So if you're looking at interpreting these data from the perspective of change, or even just interpreting the overall score, you have to unpack the items. You have to look at the items within. That that overall developing talent competency can be useful net. It may average out. But the question is, are these all really compensatory behaviors? In some ways, yes, they do reliably, based on the psychometrics, load into developing talent. But can you just ignore removing or developing performers and still be great at developing talent? Interesting question. I would argue probably no. So let's look at how this works numerically. This is the math portion of our time together. So if you're going to compare competencies, you might look like at a communication competency with 5 items, for example, and see that at time 1, 4.01 overall score, time two 3.95. They actually went down a little bit. Parenthetically, we've got quite a few examples of folks that try to use 360s for evaluating programmatically, and often scores do go down. So cautions are warranted there. So at the competency level, it's not a lot of change, but it's a little change and it's not really in the direction you want it to. But if you look at one of the items embedded within, you may find a completely different story, right? So listens to others attentively changed almost point 0.2 from time one to time two. That's a pretty material change. Remember, I used the example of about point 0.5 as your standard deviation. So this is close to a half a standard deviation shift on this particular item. So if you're going to look at change, you probably do want to look at the item level more so than the competency level. And largely that's because the competencies are just not sensitive enough as a whole to really move the dial in a material way. So again, if we look into, but there's a even further layer, the complexity of 360. Well, what if we look into the rater groups on that item? Maybe 0.18 is okay, but I sure would like to see a little bit more change than that. And so if we look at the individual rater group, we see, okay, listen to others attentively. Clearly, direct reports are more the issue here than peers or manager. And we're hearing a comment, she doesn't care about my opinion. Okay, this is all loading up into an overall score on this item of 3.66. So, this is getting us kind of our baseline, but we know a lot more by looking at the rater group, right? That, oh, this is actually really kind of a direct report issue, not a global issue for this person. So now we go ahead and look at time two scores and we find, oh, the peer data and the manager data pretty stable. The direct report data jumped up pretty well. Okay, now we're a little bit more confident that the data that we're seeing are actually telling us the story. And but we can also zero it in on that direct report. Even still, and so you can see these two scores here show much more of a difference than these two scores here. So items much better than competencies, but even still be very cautious because you're dealing with that small sample, and even that direct report shift might be not really telling a massive shift in terms of behavior. So very, very tricky to use 360s to really sensitively and accurately show that time one, time two. If you are going to do this, one caution too to consider is to think about the rater overlap, right? So was it the same for direct reports the first time as the second time, or was it radically different? So remember back to our example of the two people that were on PIPs. Maybe at time one, they didn't fill the survey out, but at time two, they did. Still four raters perhaps, or I think it was five back then, but a slightly different group. What does that mean for interpretation? So you want to use a report that shows that kind of overlap. So you can get a report that at least shows you, okay, look, in your peer group, you got 88% overlap from time one to time two, and your direct report group, 71% overlap time one to time two. Okay, maybe that's not too bad. So you perhaps get a report that looks like this. Here are the people that were invited in the first group. Here are the people that were invited in the second group. Not necessarily the people who responded. These are the people who were invited. So again, think about all the noise that you've got in here in terms of, the rater effects being radically different if you don't even invite the same people, let alone the question of, well, who actually responded. So best case, if you're doing this time one to time two, is 100% overlap. So it's possible to use a report where you literally pull the data out from time two that were in time one to make sure they all map. So anybody who filled it out time two but didn't fill it out time one, data goes out. Anybody who filled it out time one but not time two, data goes out, and you just get a apples to apples comparison. Now you've got something at least stable enough to say that you're removing the rater perceptions, because we know that's what we're looking at. So having different raters time one to time two, how do I know that it has anything to do with the participant? I mean, probably the participant has some to do with it, but it could absolutely be those specific raters and their relationship with that person, the observations they have with that person that are really different. So very difficult, if not impossible, to interpret a report where you've got different raters at time one and time two. When you do look at the data, a couple different ways to look at it. I'll kind of expand it out. You're going to be looking at average scores for the most part. It gets really nutty to try to look at frequency distributions for this much data. It just gets very complex in a report. So you can look at kind of those, average scores time one, time two, but in a and that's not a bad way to look at it. You can kind of look at this. There's a lot of math in there. Yeah, I got to go. Okay, 0.56. Oh, it went down by point. Oh, yeah, too much. So instead, showing the prior score and whether it went up or down, just displaying the change scores becomes a more reasonable way to look at the data. Um, so, okay, a lot of detail there, a lot of complexity. Let me see if I can give you some kind of basic guidelines. First is, if you are gonna compare, raters from time one, time two, I will say the self-rating time one, time two, and the manager rating, assuming it's the same person, that can be interesting, right? Let's go ahead and look at like how that manager saw things then and how they see them now, hold them accountable for it. Ideally, you want overlap at least 75% if you're not going to make it 100% and extrude the data, right? So you at least want to make sure that mostly it's the same group, but ideally you want 100%. If you're comparing competency scores, which again, not ideal, but it's an imperfect world, I get it. You want to look for changes of around zero point 0.1. It's just very complex with multiple raters, that many items to see a lot more change than that. Item scores 0.25 or more, again, about a half a standard deviation seems reasonable. And then ideally, you're thinking about rater groups, shifts in rater groups, not shifts in the overall score across all raters. You're just adding so much noise in there. And then, considering that context, et cetera, we do know that there are practice effects. One of the things that happens is that you cue raters to all the behaviors they should be thinking about, and then they start seeing them in that leader, and that may change what they observe. So very, very cautious in terms of interpreting. The key recommendations I would say is definitely don't look at here's your first report and now I'm looking at your second report. You really want a report that puts it all in the same space. Super important. You want to use this with a coach. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to leaders that are trying to make comparisons themselves and they just go in all kinds of nutty directions. You also want to be very careful about strong conclusions. And the bottom line is that you want to make sure that you're looking at the same raters time one to time two. That's going to get you a lot better success. I would say frankly, you can use 360s in this time one, time two, but I would caution against it. If I'm really wanting to look at change, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually reach out to the raters that rated the folks first time and second time. I want to keep that group constant. I'm going to say, hey, this person's been working on delegation. Have you observed any changes in the last 6 months? Be specific, right? So you're really getting it out of the numerics and out of the items where it may not show up. And you're being really direct about here's what this person's been working on. Have you seen change? That is going to get you something quite valuable. Okay, so what do you do after you get the report, right? So that post coaching moment, where does it go after, right? A lot of times in that after that initial feedback debrief, people come out going, "Oh, I completely get it. I understand where to focus," and then they go back to work. So how do you make sure that the change continues onward? Couple things. One is you want to think about, well, is my goal in this 1 hour meeting to get this person to understand where they need to work on their development priorities, or am I actually trying to get them to create a SMART goal? Um, I would suggest that you focus on the priorities and not the goals. We know from goal setting research, it's one of the best ways to move behavior that there is. However, in that 1 hour and processing the feedback, the first step is really just to go, what are your strengths? What are your development areas? What are people observing in your behavior? And then ideally come out of that meeting with something like what I've got written here, sort of a development priority about where they need to focus and what you're seeing in the conversation. And then from there, you move on to development goals, right? So as I mentioned, SMART goals are great, but maybe that's that next step. Maybe you link this to a conversation with an HR manager that can help support them and or the person's manager themselves to say, okay, great, we know where you need to focus. We know it's about communication, but let's actually write a SMART goal, something like this, that you can measure and track over time. In 1 hour, it's very difficult for a coach to go through the process of understanding the context, understanding the ratings, understanding, what where this person's energy is and where they can focus, distill it down into 1 to 3 development areas. Oh, and then we're going to talk about measuring progress. Like it's just a bridge too far. So really start with those development priorities, walk out of that meeting with a clear set of here's where you need to focus in context. Now, go step out and work on accountability with your manager, with HR, or other supports to help really make sure you're moving the dial and have some specifics to follow up on. Because while SMART goals are great, it's a little much to do in that initial meeting. You, of course, could do a follow up meeting, but I often recommend, unless you're an internal coach, that you really want an internal resource that can help support that accountability aspect because they're just going to have a lot better access to the ability to do so than someone from the outside. Okay. Well, that was 45 minutes of a lot of detail, hopefully useful. I'm open to questions at any level of detail or not.
Thank you, Dale. We do have a couple questions in the chat that have come up. So I'll start
Okay.
with those and then we can actually, if we get through those, we can have people raise hands and ask you questions live if they want, or you can also put more in the chat. The
Great.
first one, Anne asked, what is your approach with participants who rate themselves extremely high in everything, well above all other raters?
Yeah. So sometimes they'll just rate fives because they're trying to cook the books. They think, oh, this is going to help me get a promotion or something. My experience is that usually it's a sobering moment for them that they aren't as good as they think. Um, or at least others don't see them to be as, perfect on everything. And so I usually put it on them. I say, really, there's none of these behaviors that you authentically feel like you could be better at these. Interesting. I don't usually see that. Usually people recognize there are some things they could do better. So if you had to pick like a couple, I'm not going to ask you to give me a number or change your rating, but like of all these things, where do you think you need to develop? Or I'll ask, why do you think they see it differently than you? And they may stay in a defensive mode, but at the end of the day, they kind of know that they're being defensive. And usually they recognize that they're missing an opportunity to have a coach help them think through what's really going on. At the end of the day, if they're still going to be stubborn and insist that they're perfect, you gave it your best shot. You can only lead the horse to water.
And Anne, you can feel free to also speak
Hmm.
up if there's a follow-up
Yeah,
question or
please.
if Dale didn't quite hit it.
Yeah, please
Um,
challenge me anytime. I'm up for it.
The next one is from Dane. He said, for first-time participants, many read their ratings as a grade,
Yep.
even if the assessment uses a frequency scale. How do you help people set aside the expectation of acing the assessment and instead focus on what the assessment is really there to show them?
Great question. Yeah. So I often use the words, it's natural to think of this as a grade. It's not. It's a complex view into the way you're landing within this social system today. And people ask the one I usually hear is like, well, so you do a lot of these. How did I do? Right. And I'll say, yeah, that's kind of the grade question. You're asking me like what is my grade? Um, and what I usually say is I can't really look at these that way because there's so much complex information that I can't just say good or bad. It's like, well, that's like from this angle it's this way and from that angle it's the other way and there isn't really an overall conclusion. Notice that you don't have a single score at the end. There's no one number because it all is complex and nuanced. And then I'll show some examples like the ones that I did where, well, gee, your direct reports feel like you're really micromanaging, but everyone else thinks you're doing great on that. So what's your grade? Well, it's not that simple. Yeah, usually I try to just move them past that. the this is where the norms can be helpful a little bit. And actually, to be fair, and don't tell anyone I coach on this. I do flip it sometimes. So somebody who scores really like above the norm on almost everything, I will absolutely point out how well they are received within the organization. Someone who's, for example, is new to a role, I'll say like, look, the people here are big vote of confidence. You should take that as a call to action and to make sure your voice is being heard. So, while I'm not per se giving them a grade, I am saying like, wow, look, these are relative to that norm, pretty high, consistently high scores. And it is kind of a vote of confidence. Someone who's got like more mixed stuff, then I'm like, don't think about this as a grade. Think about this as an opportunity to identify where you can develop. And by the way, it's totally natural to think of this as a grade.
Elizabeth asked in the conversation about competency averages versus item averages,
Mhm.
do you use the competency page to indicate what items you should dig deeper into, or do you prefer to start with the item deep dive?
Yeah, no, I start with the competency page. Usually the competency page tells me a little bit about rater groups too. I was doing one the other day where the peer scores were all low across the board. So I'm like, okay, there's probably something going on with the peer data. We'll probably see that throughout. And then maybe there'll be a competency difference where, yeah, one of them will be lower than the other. There's also in our report, there's a page that looks at each competency by uh, by rating within. So not just the average, but then like the frequency distribution. I always look at that for, oh, are there any ones or twos in here that are going to show up in a competency? Because the average score might be really high, but there still could be a bunch of ones or twos. So that one's really key to figure out, oh, I better drill down there. But I always like to have the big view first before digging into the items. And then I'll often go to the highest and lowest scores to kind of get a sense of what's clustering together. Because then when I go in to look at the detail for the item, I can understand, oh, this is among the lower 10 or higher 10, kind of where are their scores generally at the item level falling. Um, and then, yeah, then I drill down into the individual items. And I always save the comments for last. I think the comments are pretty useful, but kind of can be not useful too. They can be distracting to the individual. Sometimes they'll provide good context, but people aren't great despite our instructions that do improve the comments. Um, it's hit or miss. So I don't want one or two comments to skew my more objective interpretation of the data the way I'm seeing them.
So Katie said, access doesn't always mean clients remain more accountable to an internal HR person because the HR person is another employee. That's been my
Yeah.
experience. How is your experience different based on what you said?
So I was talking to a CHRO just yesterday about this, who was saying the kind of maybe a little bit embedded in your question is, should the person just own the report themselves and not share it with others? And she was saying, hey, it seems like there's a lot of valuable data here. Do we really just have to leave it with the direct report, like, or the individual? Like, shouldn't there be some accountability within the organization? I would argue there should. I would argue, and again, yeah, no, I would argue there should. There should be some accountability internally, again, about those goals, right? So here are your development priorities that emerge from the report. Does an HR person need to read the comments to find out that someone put some snippy, snide thing in there or some distracting comment that gets the HR person off in a spiral? No. But they do need to know, hey, delegation is something this person's working on, and let me provide some resources on how to do that. And I would argue, by the way, if delegation is a serious issue for this person that they are working on, maybe we move them into a different slate from a succession standpoint because I don't want to promote someone who can't delegate. Um, a lot packed in there. But what I would say, so I would argue that internal resources in the right organization ought to be leveraged. But I think embedded in what your question is internal resources aren't always capable of that, aren't always quite as good at that. And in that case, again, context is everything. Then yeah, maybe you pitch the idea that the coach should be that accountability support. And again, follow-up sessions, absolutely. So if you want to do say 4 sessions where the first one is around to identify your priorities and the second one is about get your goals together, be specific, and then third and fourth are how are we doing on those goals. But I would say third and fourth, you want to make sure you're collecting kind of some data that aren't just that person going, "Oh, it's going great. I'm delegating. Awesome." Really? Okay. So again, that's where access starts to come into play. But again, maybe you can partner with somebody internally to say, "Hey, I need some objective data on this topic." Um, so yeah.
Okay, Katie followed up with, I was speaking to leaving more accountability to be with the coach. I
Okay.
wasn't
Yeah.
specifically thinking about the content of the report value.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I'm understanding right, yeah, I think that's kind of what I was saying. It's like if you want the
Mm,
coach to be the accountability person, you just want to make sure you build in some follow-ups versus trying to do it, at the outset. And then again, you want to make sure it's kind of concrete. Maybe that answers your question.
yeah, she just said yes, it does.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Um, I think you're probably going to agree with this one, Dale. Irwin said there's always variability. Why even discuss tiny score changes?
Yes. You must have taken the master class, Erwin. Yeah, no, I think that's right. But we just run into clients that want to look at this. I actually have a paper. We could send it out on where people want to do like they'll use like 360 scores to evaluate leadership programs, right? And they'll want to see the scores go up, and it's always going to be the competency level because you get too much detail and it's too complex. And we strongly recommend against that. And so it's really more about clients pulling for we want to prove that this is working and can't we just use the tool to do that. And the point is it's not really built for that. And it's not, I mean, you can under these circumstances I've described, but like as you can see, it's a fair amount of effort to try to get same rate or same time, all that stuff. So by and large, yes, I would agree with you. I think change scores are problematic. And there are better ways to track change. And I know enough clients push for it. I mean, we built a report to be able to accommodate the request. So um, if you if you've made your great arguments, used my data, my suggestions, your own, and they still insist, well, maybe now you have some guidelines as to how to go about it.
Walter had a comment. He said, I found the 360 info is most helpful when linked to specific organizational results as
Mm.
identified by the coachee manager.
Yeah, I mean, embedded in that is the critical issue that really you should have the person's manager involved. Their manager, I mean, the manager is the hidden benefactor of a 360 process, right? If I'm a manager and someone goes through a 360 process and I personally struggle with setting a schedule to work with someone on development and check in with them on how they're doing and where they should be developing and growing because I'm very busy, lo and behold, they're going through a 360 process. Guess what? It's fairly structured. There's a whole list of behaviors. I'm going to get some clarity. I should be involved in helping this person develop. So I think making sure that that manager is involved is just absolutely a best practice. And we know that not all organizations do it, but I would totally agree that that's a critical piece of the puzzle. And we in fact recommend doing that coaching session, and then in fact I'm going to be doing one in about 2 hours. Meeting with that individual and their manager to go, okay, here's what we're seeing. How can you support? And in fact, that session I'm doing, the manager is actually going to be included in that. And that person will be responsible for the accountability aspect. Again, to the question before, because this organization is really good at that, and it's going to be they'll work very much in tandem, where the HR person's actually even helping support the manager on the accountability side, et cetera. Which, from my perspective, is ideal. It doesn't get us more billable hours, but it does build capacity within the organization at the end of the day. That's best for everyone.
Okay, everyone, thank you again for all your questions. Thank you for joining us. We'll send out the recording by email. Get in touch if you're interested in learning more about our 360 Partner Program. We are planning to do additional sessions like this with new topics, so stay tuned for those. And let us know if there's something particular you'd like to learn more about. We'd love those to be generated by consultants like yourself. All right, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.